Okay, and I'm starting the next one literally right now. So it's the same time as you guys got to view the previous one. But let's talk about the second step of entries advanced. And that is simply kind of moving even beyond the EVC to significantly lower. So already you understand that you have an EVC. And again, for the longest time, I used exactly this framework right here to get behind moves the exact same way you've seen. And all my entries are still based on the exact same EVC, where my E is that 65 minute, my V is potentially that daily, and my C is that weekly, right? So all that is true. And when you see me take an entry, and now this is live, it's based on that 65-minute entry through the long. It's based on that 65-minute entry through the long, through the double MB here. It's based on that 65-minute entry through the double MB right here. That's all the same thing. But now your second, you're 2 of 2, because now we're on 2 of 2, right? We just did 1 of 2, and we looked at simple entries being advanced to understand that the simplicity is actually rooted in a multitude of setups where you can be wrong, you can be patient, you can recognize that there's break-evens and things that will happen before you get your move, or even losses, and that's all good and dandy. But the next step is understanding that you can actually, based on the timeframes you're using for the EVC, step basically lower. So you can think about this as like an E micro. I'm making up this word, but this is really what's happening. You can think about an E micro, and I'll give you the rule right now. You can use maybe you can use a division of around 30. So it's like you can use a 30x multiple. So that means, if you're trading a 65-minute and you divide it by 30, you'll get to like a 2-minute, right? If you're using a 1 minute and you divide it by 30, you'll get to a 2-second chart, right? If you're talking about trading on a daily chart, which is 24 hours, you're talking about looking at a 1 hour. And this is something we'll talk a lot more about. But this is basically the second step of entries refined, which is simply studying for your own data collection, for your own data sets, what the E micro, so what is that even lower time frame doing during one of these setups. Now, again, this is very important because I want it to be clear that we're not using the E micro itself to enter a trade. We're not going to that lower time frame and going, okay, there's another accumulation MB, and there's a perfect one right there, and I got to enter it perfectly, right, to align it all. You can do that. That's a way to use simple EVC, or you would now be using like an EVCC, right? But that's not why we're doing it. What we're actually doing is we're using the E micro, using a basically 30. For me, I've used a 30. So what I'm doing is I'll look at a 65-minute, and then I'll look at the 2-minute inside of it. That's my E micro. Right. What we're doing actually is we're basically studying what made up the MB that's happening right now. So I drew a little example here, and I'm going to walk you through it very quickly. But ultimately, we already know, right, that if this is happening on our E time frame, so let's assume for me, this is a 65-minute chart. If I have MB1 and MB2 is forming, right, and I want to buy stop here, which I already know I want to do. I want to buy stop here, and we already know that on average my stop loss, because I've already given you the rule about the ATR, but we'll have a section on management where we talk about simple buy stopping, sell stopping, what it all means in case you don't know, ATRs and how they all function. So let's just say a 1x ATR is maybe like this amount right here, 1x ATR. So the stop could be somewhere here. So we take a buy stop through this high, right? We already know we want to do this. Let's say price is somewhere in here. We already know we want to do this. What you can do as an advanced entry is you can actually now include the E micro. Okay, very simply, to study the action. So for me, that would be a 2-minute. So again, a 30x multiple, or a 30 divided x multiple. So 65 over 30. So think about 60 over 30 is equal to 2 minutes. Okay. So what I can do is I can use the E micro now as an advancement of entries to ask myself, is the lower time frame action in line with what I've usually seen for good entries? And again, I'm not using this to enter because already what do we know is true about this MB if we were to go down on another 6x multiple lower? If this was, for example, our V time frame, what do we know is true about this? Well, we know if this is our V time frame and we go lower into it, maybe with a 6x multiple, we're going to see what? We're going to see a move that goes to stage 2, flushes out to below averages, then begins to build accumulation MBs, and then takes off, right? We already know that because that's what we've already studied and done multiple times and understood the fractals of. Now, if we go even lower, so this is where I'm bringing in the micro, or I'm bringing in a 30x multiple, so way, way lower. what we're going to see is we're going to see a full like big cycle playing out. Whereas we go to it, we might see the delivery of a stage 2. We might see a major potential flush, a buildup of potential lows, a move, maybe accumulation MBs, maybe even a momentum MB or a flush into accumulation MBs, momentum MBs, and then delivery. So what's happening is we are basically studying the moves that are happening within an entry that we're already taking off a micro, but we're not trading the micro. We're simply using it to basically analyze and decide if it's worth taking something or not. This is how you further refine your own analysis and your understanding of entries. So what I mean by this is if we look at an E micro and we go inside of this thing, what we might see, right, is something like this. This might be the full cycle kind of thing playing out. You have a stage 2, a major flush. Maybe you have the buildup of some stuff, a flush, a buildup, maybe momentum MB or a flush. And then this is still that same buy stop right here. That's that same buy stop as the buy stop right here. So nothing changes. The entry is exactly the same. And what I really want to make clear right now is that if at the moment this is too much for you to take in, you do not have to apply or use a version of this in your own trading or your own analysis just yet. What you can do is you can take this idea and just take a screenshots of what the E micro is doing at the time of your entries to understand where, what do they look like? Because what you might notice over time is that the best potential MBs do similar things on these lowers. But what's really cool about using a lower in terms of an E micro, right? And this is why I utilize it myself, is that it creates benefits around, one, where you might place your stop. I'm going to show you examples of this in a second. And two, how you then manage your stop, how you manage your stop in the overall move. So you'll actually have defined ways to manage your stop maybe quicker in some instances than you may have if you were just using a 65-minute and watching the 65-minute. Because again, on a 65-minute, all of this action here could simply look like this, just a candle. And for some of you, that might be very hard to judge whether or not it makes sense to take off risk, to move your stop losses to break even or not. So what we can do is we can use the E micro, okay? The E micro and the actual cycle that's occurring on the E micro to decide if it makes sense to do a certain thing with the actual management. Okay. Now, again, that's a lot. Maybe you wrote down notes. I hope you did. Maybe you watched a little bit later. But now I'm going to show you like a few examples of that. Okay. So again, do not forget the entry is still based entirely on the simple EVC. So in my specific case, where I'm looking at a 65-minute entry, the entry itself is still only based on the fact that a double MB or the accumulation MBs have started, right? It flushed out to below the averages. Maybe it's come above, or the average is somewhere here. It just came above and it's making the double MB. The entry itself, the buy stop, is still based on buy stopping that entry. Okay. But what I'm then doing is I'm using the E micro to say, okay, is the E micro doing what it's normally doing inside of these other entries I've taken for me to be more confident in taking this risk? And can I now use that E micro to manage my stops better, or to even manage my stop loss and set my initial stop loss better? Okay, and I'm going to show you examples of that right now, specifically why it can be very, very powerful. So what usage, here we go. What usage does studying some lower timeframes also add of the given entry? So this is basically saying that we're trading a simple EVC, right? Or you have multiple Cs if you're looking at a few timeframes if you want to. But we're trading a basic EVC, which for me, which Anton, right, that's me, is a 65-minute, a daily, a weekly, right? So again, I want to see the weekly in a momentum cycle. The daily is moving in a clear momentum cycle. Maybe it's in MMB1 and it's going sideways. I'm expecting that sideways on the entry time frame to be what? A flush down to the averages, the build of accumulation MBs, and then the entry through MB1, MB2. I want to buy stop here. And all I'm doing now is I'm saying, what could be the benefit of studying the action in here on a micro? So what I'm saying is E micro, let me draw that high in. So that's this high being drawn, right? Price comes up here. What actually happened inside of here? Can I study what actually happened in here and how it looked? And is there benefits to doing so? That's it. So what usage does studying some of these lower timeframes give to you? And I'm going to show you it right now. So from a very basic lens, this is MSTR. I traded this move myself. I think I traded it with a little bit of a tighter stop. And I'm going to show you some aspects of that right now. But here's MSTR. And what I did is I just highlighted two trades specifically. So again, you're in an MMB off a validation time frame, right? This is the daily in this case. You're coming down. We're expecting that to lead into a flush, into potential MBs. And from there, you start to do what? You start to kind of have this MB1, maybe MB2, maybe MB3. But again, because of what you learned in the last video for advanced entry cycles, you maybe look at this as an MB1. This is forming that MB2. So you're willing to take a buy stop through here, through this high, and you're happy to take a buy stop through there. Done. Right? That's one of the buy stops you're willing to take there. This is a buy stop you're already willing to take an entry on because it's meeting the rules that you generally look for what's going on here. And again, if you had taken that, right, at the time, you might have not been 100% certain how you might want to put your risk on it. So you might have just thrown your stop loss maybe behind the MB or just behind the moving averages in this case, right? So just under the moving averages or with a multiple of the ATR, like I've taught you before. So that might be one of the entries you look for. Another entry you might look for is this one right here, right? Why? Well, in this case specifically, it's still within the high of the MMB, which means you're still kind of in the potential flush and the accumulation buildup, just like we spoke about before. And because of what you learned in the last video, right? Even though this might appear like a 1, 2, 3, 4, it could also very simply act as a 1, 2, and that's an MB2, or 1, 2, and it's a double MB. Based on how the move is happening, maybe you're happy to take that, right? And again, in this case, if you had taken this, the question becomes, what do you protect? Are you going to protect, this low here? Are you just going to protect overall kind of under the averages? All of that is perfectly valid, or use a multiple of the ATR. Perfectly fine. Where is now the benefit of taking this a step further and saying, okay, given I understand all this, given that the entry is perfectly fine and I'm willing to take the entry already, what is my E micro saying? And what are now the benefits of studying an E micro inside of these? So again, this is advanced entries, but what is the benefit of looking at an E micro? Well, the benefit of looking at an E micro, so here what I've done is I've opened a 2-minute chart. So again, this is a 30x multiple of what we did before. And what I did is, again, think about a line across this MB high right here. Think about that line. Think about a line across that MB high here. What I'm making sure to specify here is that's the line. That's the entry of that 65-minute. That's the entry of that 65 minutes. So again, it's with those larger stops. Those are the entry of the 65-minute. All is valid. And then all I've done, I didn't do it perfectly here, but all I've done on the 2-minute is imagine the same exact entry, nothing different. So again, I know I put it a little bit lower. Oh, no, I didn't. I put it the same spot, did I? Okay, just imagine this entry of the 2-minute is at the same point here. Right, so very simply, it's the same entry price. You're still buy stopping the exact same area. Nothing has changed. But what is now the benefit of studying an E micro or the action side of a move for you? Well, the benefit of it is that you can go through the steps that led to this move. So in this case, what I've done is I kind of just drew it out, but very simply, and again, in this case, you can ignore these gray lines at the moment. We will get into the usage of something like this and what you can do with the usage of this personally a little bit later. You don't have to worry about it much. You can get rid of it too on your own charts. Just don't worry about it right now. We will talk about it though. But if you study the move inside of here, what actually happened, right? You kind of had this stage 2. Price went through maybe a major flush. Price began to build accumulation MBs, momentum MBs, flushed, accumulation MBs into a stage 2, right? Momentum MBs. And at that time, that's where it tapped you in, right? So that might be something that you add into your repertoire to understand that the E micro has to kind of go through some version of a move like this. Simply because the entry is still the same thing. The entry is still this high and this buy stop. But let's say you went inside of it, right? Let's say you went inside of that action, and on the 2-minute, let's say you saw something like this, right? At that point, even though the action might be just as contained, so actually I'll do it like this, right? Because now the action would be the same thing, right? It would still be contained. So the 65-minute chart now would look the exact same for the most part. But as you go into a 2-minute, you start to look at this and you go, okay, this does not look similar to the E micros that I've seen before on good moves. So that might be a reason I may stay out of the move to start with. So what's really cool about the E micro is that you're not changing your entry. You're not changing the MB. You're not changing anything. You're not looking inside of it to say, where's the better entry? You're like, I got to buy stop this MB, because that's not what you're doing. You're not looking for a lower entry. You're using the E micro to study the actual action to decide if it's now worth taking an entry still, and you're just willing to take it, or if you're like, I don't like this, I'm staying away from it. That's all you're doing with it, right? And the other very, very cool benefit of using an E micro, which is what you'll see kind of right here, is that you can define your stop in a little bit of a better way. So instead of, like I said before, being on the 65-minute and not being sure exactly where you want to put your stop, taking that exact same entry, no difference, it's the same entry, you can say something like, okay, based on this, I'm happy to throw my stop behind the most recent like averages that were kind of together back here. So maybe I'll throw my averages here, or behind a most recent MB, or behind a most recent momentum MB, or a little bit lower than momentum MB. So what you do is you change simply where you throw your stop, right? And your stop might become tighter, which means that you actually open up yourself to potentially more reward when you're correct, of course. And now what's also really cool is that you can use that to also manage. So for instance, in this case, when price begins to go higher and then pauses and then begins to take off higher through that high, that might be where you end up moving your stop to break even and taking off risk, right? Now you have no risk on this trade whatsoever, and you can use a micro to actually manage the move itself, to have a more rule-based way to move your stops to break even and take off risk on a move. Right, so now again on a 65-minute, what might that move look like? It might just be, the candle might look like this. Now, if you were on a 65-minute, you might not have the confidence because you don't have the rule yet or the understanding yet to take your stop and move it up to break even because you're like, hey, price is here. Why would I move my stop up? But by using an E micro, what you've now done is you've added more data that you can now use to actually create rules around management. So when you see that 2-minute go, pause, and start to move through the high, you go, okay, I'm happy to take my stop. I'm happy to take my risk off this by moving my stop to break even and let this thing do whatever it wants, right? And you can now do that with a better stop as well, because what you're doing is you're allowing the E micro to function as a potential stop placement, right? And you can still use the ATR of the higher time frame, of the E time frame, to basically establish if this is large enough or not. And now we're going to talk about management more, but I'll give you the example right now. So this is very simply where if you look at this, what I have on the MentiFX Premium is I have the ATR value set to the 65-minute chart. That's it, right? I just have it set to the 65-minute chart. So this ATR here is the actual ATR of the 65-minute chart. That's the average move of the 65-minute chart. Now, if I go back here at the time of the setup, you can see the ATR was 0.34. Now, what's cool is if I go to a 2-minute right now, boom, you'll see at the bottom here, the ATR is still set to 0.34 because this is the E micro. I don't want the averages or the volatility or anything of the E micro to affect my entry or my stops. So I still know what the ATR value of the 65-minute is, which is my entry time frame. And what I can do is I can now look at this setup and I can say, okay, is it doing generally what I want to see it do? And the answer is yes. Here, I'll hide this thing like I said I would. But the answer for me is yes, right? It kind of went through this nice stage 2. Price began to come down through a flush, started to make some kind of accumulations in here, came down, now it's an accumulation. This looks really clean for a setup. I'm happy to take this. So we're good to take a setup. And now I can say something like, okay, let me put a stop loss on this trade. So let me take this whole thing and move it over. And you can see when I would take this entry, right, the stop currently is set to 0.25. And you can see that's just around 1x multiple or less than the ATR. So this is a way where I can basically decide where do I want to throw my stop. On the micro here, I can kind of throw it either here, which is 0.14, which is very low. Maybe I could do that, but I'd probably not. I can throw it behind this low, which I can, 0.20, perfectly valid. Or I can throw it behind kind of the last time these MAs kind of played around intersected, which could be somewhere around here, which I think is what I did. I made my stop around 0.25 or something, 0.3. Again, I allowed basically for a larger area to act as a stop from the E micro, even though it's still based on the 65-minute entry. And now instead of having to guess, where am I going to put my stop here? Is it here? Should I put it here behind this candle? I have a way to define that through just a few simple rules. And I have the ATR value, the volatility value, to actually decide if it makes sense or not. And at the same time, I'm going to show you this now, I have simple rules that are going to lead to break-evens. What I mean by that is if price now validates, starts to pause, and then goes through the high, that is going to be enough for me to now move my stop up instead of having to guesswork, because let me show you. Price starts to go, it pauses, and then moves above. I moved my stop on this move right here. When this happened, I moved my stop up here. That's it. My stop was now at break even. Now take a look at the 65-minute chart. It was actually lower. It was actually smaller than this, but at the time, literally, it looked like that, right? Now, if I came to you and simply said, move to break even when the candle looks like that, it wouldn't make much sense. There's not much rules around that. There's not much understanding behind that. There's not much use of the cycle or anything behind that. But now you have the advancement understanding of entries, which is you can take yourself to a micro and use the micro to, one, facilitate and decide whether the action of it means that you should continue to buy stop the high. I can notice I'm not buy stopping some random MB in here or 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 in here. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is the buy stop is still the exact same thing. The only advancement is now to ask myself, does it still make sense based on what I see on the micro to take this entry? And in my case, it's yes. And two, I now have a better way to set a potential stop instead of having to guesswork where I'm going to put it because the MB might be larger on a higher time frame, which it is on my entry time frame. And three, I have a defined way to now measure when I'm going to move my stop loss to break even, given that the move makes sense for moving to break even, right? So you have those three positives, those three benefits to using an E micro. Now, that's right. That's what's one example right there. And here's another example right here. Take a look, right? So again, that's that same entry, same high. Let me show you that. That's that same entry, same high. But all of a sudden, as I'm on a lower, I have a way to define a better stop. So in this case, when I'm looking at this and I'm taking this long, right? I like what this move looks like. It looks perfectly fine for me to set up a long here. It's still the same long, same exact entry price on long. As price taps in, pauses, then moves higher, maybe pauses, then moves higher, I'm moving that overall move to break even. So I know how to move my stop now. Notice that my initial stop is a lot smaller too. And then here is the beauty of basically of showing you the positives of doing what I've just said, right? All of a sudden, you moved from that move that looked like that and like that to these moves here because you've used the E micro to refine, again, same entry, but you've used the E micro to refine where your stop's going to go and then how you're going to manage your stop, which means you save more money over time. And the big change in this is that initially, with this one, this ran about 9 RR, this ran about 7 RR. That's what this means. So initially, this trade was 9 RR, this was 7. But simply through the addition of an E micro and allowing that to help me set stops that make more sense, that make it more closer, that was changed to 30 and 19. So again, this is a huge difference. The trade was worth over 3 times more in both cases by using an E micro as an advanced entry addition to what you're doing. So again, nothing changed. It's the same EVC, it's the same entries. The only thing that changed is that we're using an E micro to now decide if it still makes sense to trade it. So again, that's going to come from case studying, to define where the stop's going to go, and then to define how we're going to manage that stop. And as another example, this was that example there. And I'll show you this example here as well. So this is another entry I took. Remember, we'll go with the 65-minute first because again, the entry itself was based on what? The 65-minute buy stop through this high. So I drew that line in just to show this. And then if I go over to back here as it was forming and I go to the 2-minute, here you are. You have the same thing. You have price come to that high, kind of comes down, flushes out. And you should already, as I'm doing this, see similarities between some of these 2-minute or these E micros, right? Where price comes down, comes up, kind of pauses, right? In this case, and then you're just expecting that move to happen. And I'll show you. The move starts, it pauses, starts moving higher. And again, right here, I move my stop to break even. So I have a way to define my break evens on my stop, even though the 65-minute is still maybe just making one candle. And it's not that clear as to why I'm just easily doing that. And then price takes off, right? And now we're up here, which is just crazy. This was a wild move. And what's cool is, again, we can take this to the next step. I can show you another example right now because, if you looked at this as an MB1, MB2, and you were looking for a long here, let me draw that line in. And we'll go to the 2-minute to study the E micro here, right? Kind of what happened. Well, similar things, right? You had kind of that sell off, kind of starts coming up the right hand side. In this case, you might have bought here. Your stop might have been somewhere here. This would have taken you out, which is perfectly fine. That could have happened. And then maybe you looked at this high again and same thing happened. Maybe you're like, okay, I don't like how choppy this is, so you skip it, which is perfectly fine. Or if you're happy with how this looks because you're used to the E micro doing any one of these versions, then you take this long here, you wait, price kind of pauses, takes off, you move to break even, price never comes back to break even. Take a look. There you go. Misses that break. Actually, no, it does come back to that break even. Okay, it's a bad example then. Or unless your rules were to wait a little bit, wait for this, and then move to break even here, this would have come back. So you know what? Ignore me in this specific case. But nonetheless, that's what this trade was based on, right? This was the E micro. This is what the E micro kind of looked like. I'm used to the E micros doing a little version of this. I'll go over more of these a little bit later, but again, it's the same setup. So I want this to be very clear because I don't want you to complicate or confuse yourself with the E micro and being like, oh my God, this is bad, because the action doesn't necessarily have to be bad or good. Just just keep it in mind, and also allow it to potentially help you with setting stops, right? Because this stop that I set was based on this 2 minute. I looked at the ATR, which is 1.85, and I said, okay, take a look. It's around 1.27, so around 1 ATR. And what did I do? I said, this low here, if I use the overall low, was around 1.7. I could have done that, but all I did is I said, okay, price started going, momentum MB kind of took off here. I could probably move my stop somewhere where these MAs first started moving upwards, kind of crossed, or just behind this MB here, which is kind of what I did, and I threw it a little bit lower. This is honestly all I did. Again, there was no perfect stop to have there. It was just simply based on, let me go like this. Yeah, you can see I just kind of threw it under the MAs because again, I'm using the E micro to just allow me to define a larger stop. Because all I'm doing is I'm understanding that there's still a cycle happening here, and I'm protecting most of the cycle off of a very E micro. And that simply gives me a better way to manage my risk, to basically set risk on this time frame here, where, again, I might not be certain. Maybe I put it here, maybe I put it here, maybe I put it here. I don't know. Because again, my stops are not based on the MB sizes of an entry time frame, which is very important because, I might take an MB entry, something like this, and my stop could still be here. Right? And that could still become a break-even trade now, even though it looks like it was just super wild and it wouldn't have given you a chance to do that. So that is your second step of E refinement and E advancement, which is to understand that, of course, there's constant fractals going on of the price you're looking at. And you can now use an E micro to better set your management, to better understand if a move is worth taking or not, to better ask yourself, does this move still make sense? So it's going to take a few shots, right? So like take your photos of your entries, of your case studies, and study the lowers of them, right? So like even here, right, and here, if we go lower and look at it, you're going to see similar things to what you saw in this video already, which is that as I go in here, what kind of setup do you see, right? Price comes down, kind of does this same little move here, and then starts to move higher. So again, that kind of major flush or big flush starts as accumulation MBs, momentum MBs, flushes out, accumulation MBs, and then takes off. Maybe make some momentum MBs on the way. It doesn't really matter. Then takes off, and I move to break even. Similarly, if you look at this one, another move that was really, really good and delivered very well. Take a look at what happened. Price came down, kind of flushed out, started moving higher, right? Multiple momentum MBs and accumulation MBs, flush out, accumulation MBs, momentum MBs. Again, the entry is just taken through here. I'm not using this to take an entry. I'm using it to say, is it kind of valid for an entry? And I like this action because what it's showing me is clear demand eating up supply because it's going through a full cycle on this E micro. And then setting up for a move. And again, as price goes, pauses, you can move to break even somewhere around here. And again, price never returns. If you took this entry, price never returns. Maybe your initial stop was somewhere like here, I'd say. Move it up to break even and price takes off. And again, you get, in this case, this very, very, very beautiful, absolutely phenomenal move. And I'm actually still in this with my stop just managed up here right now because this thing just went for a crazy move, all from that MMB2. So now you have your two basically entry advancements, which is just understanding, if we were to recap, on one hand, the entry is always a double MB, but the double MB that you actually find or end up trading is kind of based in a lot of cases within multiple MBs and multiple formations, and we use the averages and our tools to decide if it makes sense to take it. And the second step of that is to say, now that you understand your normal EVCs and the entries you're willing to take, and already, if you're profitable doing exactly what you're doing right now with a set EVC, don't worry about doing the E-micro thing or complicating it further. But it's something that you can keep an eye on. So this can work for someone that's collecting data and they just collect more data now, or for someone that maybe is struggling a little bit and they're like, I just need a little bit more confidence in the entries I take. This can do both of those things, okay? See you in the next one.